Nobody in Birchwood Falls, Minnesota thought much of it that first winter when 12-year-old Dominic Sorensen started drilling a small test hole near the dock behind his family's property every single morning before school. Lowering a wooden dowel marked with careful pencil measurements down through the ice, checking a thermometer, and recording both numbers in a spiral notebook that, by February, had filled nearly cover to cover. Dominic had used a wheelchair since a car accident 3 years earlier left him with a spinal injury, and most of the small lake town assumed his morning ice routine was simply something to occupy him through a long winter, a wheelchair-bound kid's way of feeling connected to a lake he could no longer skate on himself. They weren't entirely wrong about the connection part. They were wrong about almost everything else. Birchwood Falls held its annual ice festival on the lake every February, drawing families from 3 counties out onto the frozen surface for skating, ice fishing demonstrations, and a bonfire that had become something close to a town institution over 4 decades of tradition. That particular February, it was Dominic's careful, unglamorous morning measurements, not the town's usual visual ice checks, that ended up standing between several hundred families and a genuinely dangerous afternoon on unsafe ice. If stories about quiet vigilance, unexpected expertise, and the value of paying close attention to something everyone else takes for granted matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Dominic's. Now let's find out what Dominic's morning measurements were really tracking, and why an entire town would end up depending on them. Birchwood Falls sits on the shore of a mid-sized Minnesota lake that froze reliably enough each winter to support genuine ice culture, ice fishing shanties dotting the surface by December, pickup hockey games organized on cleared patches most weekends, and the town's beloved ice festival anchoring the community calendar every February since well before Dominic was born. Dominic's family had lived on the lake's northern shore his entire life, and before the accident that changed his mobility 3 years earlier, he'd been, by every account, one of the more enthusiastic young skaters in town, out on the ice most winter mornings before school with the same restless energy most Birchwood Falls kids brought to lake life. The accident, a highway collision during a family trip the winter Dominic turned 9, left him with a spinal cord injury that ended his skating permanently and changed, in ways his parents worked hard to help him navigate, most of the physical relationship he'd once had with the lake that defined so much of Birchwood Falls' childhood. Dominic adjusted, over the following years, the way children often do, finding new ways to stay connected to the things he'd lost easy access to, though his parents, Carl and Ingrid Sorensen, both privately worried, more than they said aloud to their son, about how much that adjustment had cost him emotionally. The ice monitoring started, as far as Ingrid could piece together afterward, almost by accident that first winter after the accident, when Dominic, watching from the dock one December morning while his younger sister and her friends tested the season's first ice, asked his father directly how anyone actually knew the ice was thick enough to hold weight safely. Carl, a practical man who ran the town's hardware store, gave his son the same rough, informal answer most Birchwood Falls residents relied on: for inches for foot traffic, considerably more for vehicles, judged mostly by experienced eyeballing and community word of mouth about how the season had been developing. That answer didn't satisfy Dominic the way it satisfied most people. He asked his father to help him drill a small test hole near the dock, close enough that he could reach it easily from his wheelchair with a long-handled auger Carl adapted with an extended grip, and began, that same week, measuring the ice thickness himself with a marked wooden dowel, recording the number alongside the morning air temperature in a notebook his mother gave him almost as an afterthought. What started as a single measurement became, over that first winter, a daily habit Dominic maintained with a consistency that impressed his parents more than they initially let on. He measured every morning before school, rain, snow, or bitter cold, adjusting his technique as he learned, through his own careful trial and error, exactly how to lower the dowel accurately and read the ice's thickness against his pencil markings. His neighbor, Pete Halvorsen, who ran an ice fishing guide business out of a shop near the public landing and had spent 30 years reading Birchwood Falls' ice conditions professionally, found the boy's routine mildly curious the first time he noticed it that January. Most folks just check the flags at the public access, he mentioned to Carl at the hardware store, referring to the informal color-coded warning system the town posted each winter based on general community observation. Carl explained his son's more particular interest, and Pete, while friendly about it, didn't think much more of the habit beyond considering it a sweet, if slightly excessive, project for a boy who'd lost his own ability to test the ice more directly himself. Word of Dominic's morning measurements moved through Birchwood Falls the way most small-town habits did. Through the hardware store, the diner, and casual conversation among neighbors who'd known the Sorensen family for years. Most of the response settled into gentle, sympathetic curiosity, a boy finding his own quiet way to stay close to a lake that had once meant everything to him, charming and understandable but not something anyone in town felt any particular need to take seriously as actual ice safety data. Dominic kept measuring anyway, through that first winter and into his second, refining his notebook into something increasingly detailed, tracking not just thickness and air temperature but noting weather patterns, snow cover which he'd learned insulated ice and slowed its freezing, and any days when he noticed unusual clear patches or visible cracks near his test site that Carl helped him document with photographs. By his second winter of measurement, Dominic had built a genuinely rigorous, consistent dataset spanning nearly 2 full seasons, considerably more systematic than the informal community observation most of Birchwood Falls relied on for its own ice safety judgments. The situation that mattered arrived during Dominic's second February, in the week leading up to that year's ice festival, when an unusual warm spell pushed daytime temperatures well above freezing for 4 consecutive days, followed immediately by a hard, sudden refreeze as an Arctic front moved through overnight. To casual observation, the lake's surface looked, by the festival's scheduled Saturday, exactly the way it always did that time of year, solid, white, and thick with weeks of accumulated winter ice. Dominic's measurements told a different story. His notebook showed that the warm spell had significantly degraded the ice's internal structure before the refreeze locked a deceptively solid-looking surface layer back over weakened ice beneath, a pattern he recognized, from 2 winters of careful tracking, as considerably more dangerous than the ice's outward appearance suggested. His thickness measurement at the test hole had actually decreased slightly through the warm spell despite the surface refreeze, and the ice, when he tested it that final morning before the festival, felt, through the resistance on his auger, noticeably softer and more porous than his notebook's typical late February readings from the previous 2 years. He told his father directly that Thursday morning, showing him the notebook's clear comparison between that week's readings and the equivalent dates from the previous winter. Carl, who trusted his son's careful work by that point more than most adults in town might have, took the concern seriously enough to walk down to the festival planning committee's meeting that same evening, bringing Dominic's notebook with him. The committee, chaired by a well-meaning but ultimately cautious woman named Bethany Kroll, listened politely but remained skeptical, explaining that the town's traditional visual ice check, conducted that same afternoon by 2 experienced longtime residents, had found the ice thick and solid by every conventional measure they knew to apply. Carl pressed the point as firmly as he could manage without overstepping, but the meeting ended without any change to the festival's Saturday schedule. Dominic, hearing the outcome from his father that evening, asked if he could present his own data directly to the committee himself the following morning, the day before the festival, and Carl, moved by his son's evident conviction, arranged an early meeting with Bethany and 2 other committee members before the town's final preparations began that Friday. Dominic walked the committee through nearly 2 full winters of measurements, explaining in the careful, precise way he'd developed through years of solitary morning routine exactly what the warm spell and sudden refreeze pattern meant for ice structural integrity, and specifically pointing to the measurable thickness decrease his own test hole had shown despite the deceptively solid surface appearance everyone else had been judging the ice by. Bethany Kroll, to her genuine credit, took the presentation more seriously than the previous evening's brief mention had allowed for, and contacted the county's emergency management office that same morning to request a proper structural ice assessment before committing to the festival's usual full public access to the lake surface. County technicians, using proper ice testing equipment considerably more sophisticated than Dominic's dowel and thermometer but confirming the same underlying pattern his data had already identified, found significant weak zones across several sections of the lake exactly matching the areas Dominic's notes suggested would be most affected by the warm spell's uneven thawing pattern. The festival went ahead that Saturday, but relocated its skating and heaviest foot traffic to a smaller, actively monitored section of the lake near the public landing where ice conditions tested reliably safe, while the sections Dominic's data had flagged remained closed and clearly marked, a modification that disappointed some attendees expecting the usual full lake access but that county officials later credited, in their own formal safety review, with likely preventing a serious ice failure incident given the confirmed weak zone's proximity to where the festival's traditional bonfire and largest crowds typically gathered. Pete Halvorsen, watching the modified festival proceed safely that Saturday, found Carl at the hardware store the following week and told him plainly that he owed Dominic an apology for ever treating the boy's measurements as a sweet but minor hobby. 2 winters of real data, Pete said, shaking his head. I've been reading this lake 30 years by eyeball, and your boy caught something I would have missed completely. By the following winter, the town's festival planning committee had formally incorporated Dominic's measurement protocol into its official ice safety procedures, with Dominic himself, now assisted by a small volunteer group Bethany Kroll organized, expanding his monitoring to 3 additional test sites around the lake's most heavily used areas. Dominic never made much of what happened that February. When people asked how he'd known the ice was different from how it looked, he usually gave some version of the same quiet answer. He hadn't known with any certainty beyond what his own numbers showed him. He'd simply kept measuring, morning after morning, for 2 full winters, because it was the one part of the lake he could still reach and understand fully, and once the numbers told him something felt wrong, he couldn't quite let it go until someone finally listened. There is a particular kind of vigilance that grows from loss, the discipline of holding on to one small, fully accessible piece of something larger a person can no longer fully reach the way they once could. Dominic Sorensen hadn't set out to protect an entire town's ice festival from disaster. He'd simply refused to let his changed relationship with the lake mean losing his connection to it entirely, and intending that connection through 2 winters of quiet, careful measurement. He caught something dangerous that every experienced adult eye in Birchwood Falls had looked right past.